here live. Public sector workers, the cost of government, where it's driving America. We've been talking about that on today's show. 1-800-282-2882. There's a heartwarming story. This will clutch at your heartstrings. From the New York Times, public workers face outrage as budget crises grow. It's about a teacher called Mary Caulfield from Flemington, New Jersey, who confronted hard-hearted Governor Chris Christie over the state's education cuts. It became a YouTube classic. But since then, she's received a stream of vituperative emails and Facebook postings. People I don't even know are calling me horrible names, said Miss Caulfield, an art teacher who had pleaded the case of struggling teachers. The mantra is that the problem is the unions, the unions, the unions. What do you mean, struggling teachers? What do you mean, struggling teachers? You've got a better deal than almost anybody else among your neighbours. And yet you say teachers are struggling. If you think you're struggling, what do you think the guy who owns the hardware store is doing? Or the guy who works in the hardware store? Or the guy who does the night shift, at the Quickie Crap Express Mart? What do you think they're like? You have a better deal. You'll retire earlier with more money. You get more vacation. You get better healthcare. You get better benefits. In what sense compared to your neighbours? Your neighbours. We're just talking about the people who live in the same suburban cul-de-sac as you. You're the same town as you. In what sense are you struggling compared to them? This lady, Marie Caulfield, the art teacher from Flemington, New Jersey, people I don't even know are calling me horrible names. Well, now you know what it's like to be an insurance executive or a bank vice president or all the other people that Barney Frank demonized beginning in the fall of 2008. All the guys that the Democrats told, hey, we're the only people standing between you and the pitchforks. Well, maybe the guys with the pitchforks are figuring it out, that the real threat here is not some, bank vice president at some stupid bank that's sitting on a $1 trillion worth of toxic subprime mortgages, but the real threat here is public sector unions with pensions and benefit packages that are in fact beyond accountable political control. You can't. They're effectively chiseled into granite. You can't even pass a law repealing them because they're there. They're done. They're a done deal. They're a deal for all time. You can't get a court to overturn them. You can't elect a legislature to overturn them. All you can do is appeal to the public spirit of so-called public sector unions to recognize that they're dragging the rest of the country down into the pit. The cost of we now have too small a private sector horse to pull the big government cart. It's not that difficult to figure out. These guys are simply too big, too cosseted, and too insulated from economic reality. So Marie Caulfield perhaps quite genuinely thinks that teachers are struggling. Well, sorry, you signed on to deals that are unsupportable, and that in many jurisdictions, when voters figure the electoral math is against them, as they do in California, they leave. They abandon the state. Private sector, the dynamic Californians flee that state, and they leave what's left in the state to undocumented workers and public sector unions and all the rest of it. And those guys can all scratch each other's back, and in the end they'll figure out that there's no one to pay for it all. There used to be an old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. Well, the taxpayers of New Jersey pay the piper of the teachers union, but they don't get to call the tune. They pay more and more and more, and they don't get to call the tune. And what you're doing there is setting up pre-revolutionary conditions. You look at the riots that they've had in Greece, the riots they've had in France, in Britain, in other European countries. At the moment, these riots are from people who basically are on the big government happy juice and don't want it to end. But at a certain point, that will change. And the people who are expected to pay for those guys to just sit around on the big government happy juice those guys will start rioting too, and then you'll be in civil war type scenarios. In Greece, the public sector unions, if you've got a public sector union job, you work till 2:30 in the afternoon. And you work about 5.5 months of the year. The old joke, he works 24/7. He works 24 hours a week for 7 months of the year. That doesn't even apply. You can't even do that joke about Greek public sector workers anymore, because they actually work less than that. So what we have here is an unsustainable system. And that's what people like Marie Caulfield don't seem to acknowledge. Even if you think it's a good idea, that the teachers' union does such a terrific job, that it's worth paying them more than every other developed country pays its teachers, that it's worth paying, we spend more on education than any other OECD nation other than Luxembourg. I mentioned this when we had Shannon the Educator on the show. Shannon the Educator. I'm surprised, by the way, they describe, in the New York Times, they describe Marie Caulfield as a teacher, because most self-respecting teachers now want to be called educators. We had Shannon the Educator on, who seemed to think that the problems in the country would be cured by actually giving the education system more money. No. We already give the education system more money per student than any other OECD nation except Luxembourg, which is a tiny little country you can fit in your rec room. A tiny, wealthy little country that will fit in your basement. We spend more than anybody else. We have nothing to show for it. And yet Marie Caulfield says teachers are struggling and we need more. No, we don't. We need non-unionized teachers. We need non-credentialed teachers. We need more volunteer fire departments rather than public sector unionized fire departments, because this whole racket is unsustainable. Cannot be sustained. Now, we were talking earlier with John of Pinehurst, North Carolina, who wants to know what happens when it can no longer be sustained. With money drains power. You can't let the Chinese own as much American debt as they currently own without also letting them, in fact, mortgaging to them a big chunk of American power. Jonathan Swift, they have our soul who have our bonds. The Chinese have our bonds, so to a certain degree they have our souls. About half of U.S. debt is owned by foreigners, and about half of that is owned by the Chinese. What does that mean? Well, even if your debt is owned by friendly powers, they essentially determine the power relationship. You go back to the last transfer of power from one global hegemon to another. That was Britain to America in the course of the Second World War, when FDR agreed to the Lend-Lease program. That was about as friendly a transfer of power from one Anglophone nation to another, to its successor, to its errant progeny, returning as the prodigal son to assume global leadership. That was the most friendly transfer of power in global history. And the deal stank for Britain. Lend-Lease, which the British thought of as a financial arrangement, when they signed on to it at the beginning of the Second World War. By the time they paid off the final payment at Christmas 2006, by the time they paid off the final installment of the Lend-Lease debt to the United States government, they understood that it was not just money that had drained to the successor power, but power and influence too. And the Chinese understand that already. So they are going to determine the point at which the American dollar ceases to be the global currency will be determined by China. China is not a powerful nation. It's got all screwed up problems of its own. It has millions and millions of surplus young men. It's going to get old before it gets rich. China is in a huge mess. But precisely because of that, its interests do not align with the United States, and when it chooses to yank the rug, it will be entirely predictable, and we will all be stunned by it. And that is why the new 112th Congress doesn't have to talk about raising the debt ceiling or introducing VAT or finding more ways to put its hands in your pocket and take more money for more useless programs. What it has to do is stop spending. What it has to do is reel in spending. What it has to do is tell states there will be no state bailouts, and those states have to tell their municipalities there'll be no municipal bailouts. Because the cost in terms of sheer civil violence and instability is going to get greater and greater the longer and longer this goes on. You can't have Marie in Flemington, New Jersey, like all public school teachers, retiring at an early age and a fantastic salary, and the guy who pays her salary and the guy who pays her pension and the guy who pays her benefit, and has the misfortune to own a small business on Main Street, working till he drops dead without any vacation, just to pay for the so-called struggling teachers of the New Jersey Teachers Union. So the feds have to get serious about spending, and they have to make it plain, the realities of the situation, to the states, and the states have to make the realities of the situation plain to the municipalities. Because if the 112th Congress doesn't make the decisions on this stuff, then there are guys sitting around in the presidential palaces of the world, most of which are not friendly to U.S. interests, sitting around plotting how to make the decisions in the finance ministry in Beijing and other places as well. 1-800-282-2882. Mark Steyn in for Rush. If you want my body and you think I'm sexy, well, I love that. Love Rod Stewart in his disco mode before he started doing the Rod Stewart Slaughters the Great American Songbook stuff. Do you know that was Mullah Omar's? I think that was Mullah Omar's favorite record when the American troops raided Mullah Omar's compound in Kandahar. You remember, under the Taliban, music was banned in Afghanistan. But when American troops, because music is decadent, you're not a Taliban mullah recently clarified the Taliban's position on music, which says Allah doesn't forbid you to listen to music; He just forbids you to enjoy it. So if you've heard my Christmas album, for example, you'll know that's fully Taliban compliant. But when the U.S. troops raided Mullah Omar's compound in Kandahar, they discovered that despite forbidding music anywhere else in Afghanistan, he had all these 8 tracks from Rod Stewart. Mullah Omar, the one-eyed mullah, had been bouncing around the room listening to If You Want My Body and You Think I'm Sexy. To all, I don't know whether he did it in private or in front of his 4 wives, and then invited them to compete for him. But at any rate, that was the big disco hit in Mullah Omar's compound. If You Want My Body and You Think I'm Sexy. Speaking of sexy bodies, the newly empowered House GOP has introduced a rules package for the 112th Congress that will prohibit former members of Congress who are currently registered lobbyists from using the gym. I'm glad to see they're tackling the key issues, the priorities facing this country. So if you're a registered lobbyist who was previously a congressman, you can no longer use the congressional gym because Congress type persons don't want to be, when they're on the exercise bike, they don't want to be pestered by lobbyists. So you're not allowed to, when you're working out in the gym, when Nancy Pelosi is in there in her thong and her sports bra, she doesn't want to be pestered by some lobbyist coming in and attempting to lobby her on something. So this is a sign, I think, of the new broom in Washington. The 112th Congress is already cracking down on lobbying, on letting lobbyists use the House gym. I'm glad to see they've got their priorities. Did you know the 111th Congress, by the way, added more debt than the first 100 Congresses combined? The total national debt accumulated a whole $3.22 trillion during the tenure of the 111th Congress, and that is more than was stacked up by the first 100 Congresses in U.S. history. That's the terrific spending they did, and I love the way Obama, likes to talk about how George W. Bush dug us into this hole, so that the only way he can dig us out of the hole is to make the hole, 3 times as deep. So eventually we'll come out, somewhere in Australia or New Zealand, and we can get out of the hole as long as we just keep digging and digging and digging and digging. That's the Democrats' method.